In this episode, we leave Griffith's paper temporarily. We'll come back to it in the next episode, because in the meantime, since our last episode, I've made a few discoveries in relation to St Ephrem, so I'm going to bring them to you now while they're nice and fresh. And it's been fascinating what I've been able to link up. So I've titled this Cracking St Ephrem's Code, and this is a quote from St Ephrem in his Hymns on Virginity 2012. Wherever you look, God's symbol is there. Wherever you read, you will find his types. For him all creatures were created, and he stamped all his possessions with his symbols when he created the world. That's a very useful clue into his way of thinking. When he writes his hymns, he's conscious of the idea of God's symbol in the words that he uses, in the imagery, the ideas that he presents in the hymns. So that's quite useful. So when we see him using things like pearls or grapes in his hymns, his medrashas, don't assume that that's all they are. Don't assume that they just represent spiritual rewards in paradise. There's much more to it. In particular, God is always the center of it. So as we'll see later, he finds a way of connecting it back to God. So an interesting note about the meaning of Ephrem's name. It means doubly fruitful. The symbolic meaning of his name related to fruit became a central motif of his hymns, known as medrashas, teaching hymns. So it's interesting that he was given that name, and obviously this would have had an influence on him in terms of what he chose to focus on in his hymns. Now, V. Edward G. Matthews, writing on a website, gives this interesting summary of his Christology. He says, for Ephrem, Christ is the center and focus of everything, and he cannot help but see Christ in all things. So this is a further focusing of the idea that he sees God in all symbols. So that's very helpful again. Now, I don't know if Luxembourg was aware of this, but this Madrashi on Faith, Hymn 1 from St Ephrem, is very close to the smoking gun that Luxembourg never found, and we'll see what I mean a little bit later. And the text in bold is particularly important in relation to the idea of the grapes being crystal clear. So he's talking about the Eucharist here, but he alternates between Eucharist, pearls, grapes, and so forth, all as symbols of Christ. He says, I set it, my brothers, in the palm of my hand that I might observe it. I was about to look at it on one side, but it had faces on all sides. Investigation into the sun is incomprehensible, for he is entirely light. In its clarity, I saw the clear one, who is not clouded. In its purity, a great mystery, the body of our Lord, which is unsullied. In its indivisibility, I saw the truth, which is indivisible. If we look now to Surah 37, 48 to 49, we have a strange depiction of paradise, and Bell gives us one typical translation. With them are damsels, restrained in glance, wide-eyed, as they were eggs or pearls, well guarded. Obviously this doesn't make much sense, and the idea of the wide-eyed virgins has been suggested as a translation of this obscure text. But we're going to crack it using St Ephrem. Another equally obscure and rather weird ayah in Surah 76 gives us the following according to Bell's translation. Round amongst them go boys of perpetual youth, whom, when one sees, he thinks them pearls unstrung. Now, a lot of hay has been made with that, and accusations of that these are some sort of rent boys in heaven and so on. But I think there's an instant explanation, and we need to turn to St Ephrem to decode this text. So let's take that latter one first. St Ephrem uses pearls as a symbol for Christ. Surah 76:19 and 52:54 both compare these boys to pearls. Luxembourg notes that elsewhere white grapes are also referred to as pearls. And we note in passing that St Ephrem in a hymn compares Christ to a pearl. So we can triangulate all of these similes, references to each other, and maybe decode this. So from Madrashi on Faith, hymn 1, one day, my brothers, I picked up a pearl. I saw within it mysteries. O sons of the kingdom, images and types of that majesty, it became a fountain, and from it I drank of the mysteries of the sun. So we can see here that the pearl refers to Christ. And what's interesting here in the Quran is that it refers to white grapes and boys as pearls. So grapes are referred to as pearls, and apparently, according to the translations that are gifts sometimes given, that boys are referred to as pearls. Luxemburg asks, how can one linguistically make boys into grapes? Wildan is boy in Arabic. However, in Syriac, Yalda means both child and fruit. Fruit of the vine in Syriac is Yalda da Japeta. So if we look at the translation of the Syriac, and you can find this in a Pesita version of the Gospels, I will not drink henceforth from this child of the vine, since I will drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. So we have, as we can see, a kind of a pun on the word Yalda, and if Jesus is referring to himself as the grape, as the fruit of the vine, it kind of makes a lot of sense, especially if it also means child of the vine. Now, you might question me saying that Jesus is referring to himself as a grape there, but Jesus identifies his blood with the fruit of the vine, as we can see when we look at Matthew's Gospel in context. So if we look at the verse before, he says, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. And then he refers just after that in verse 29 to this child or fruit of the vine. So his blood is the fruit of the vine. Luxemburg's solution is that the Quran renders Yalda, child or fruit, as Wildan, boy in Arabic, one of the two possible meanings in the Syriac, but it now hides the link with grapes and spoils the original metaphorical meaning. And in a sense, it's gone for a less rich meaning, would have kind of a diminished memory of the original in the Syriac. Now, we should also point out that Christ uses the symbol of the vine in two different metaphors. In one, he is the vine and his disciples, Christians, are the branches. See John 15:1. In another, at the Last Supper, he is the fruit of the vine. See Matthew 26. In Aramaic, it is even more meaningful, as it also means child of the vine. The vine then can mean, in this context, Mary. St Ephrem sometimes makes this metaphorical usage. Now, St Ephrem makes an obvious observation, really, between Eve and Mary, the sort of biblical symmetry between the two. And I found this in a book called A Tale of Three Cities, Istanbul, Bethany Hughes, and she refers to it coming from St Ephrem the Syrian, and you can see the reference underneath there. So here it is. It says, in place of that bitter fruit that Eve plucked from the tree, Mary gave mankind sweet fruit, and behold, the whole world enjoys the fruit of Mary. The virginal wine has borne a grape, whose sweet wine has given comfort to those who mourn. So you can see here that St Ephrem is very much conscious of Jesus being a grape, whereas Mary is a vine. And he doesn't always use this type of metaphor. Sometimes he's referring to Jesus as the vine, but depending on the context, he can switch between different uses of everyday symbols to make a point. But all of this is obviously drawn from the Bible, so he's not making the stuff up. He's just drawing it from a study of the Bible. Okay, so Eve brings bitter fruit to mankind, whereas Mary brings sweet fruit, and Jesus being the sweet fruit. Okay. Okay, so all of that is fine. How can we understand Surah 76:19? Bell translates as, "Round amongst them go boys of perpetual youth, whom when one sees he thinks them pearls unstrung." So we have to kind of turn to Luxembourg to get an answer to that problem. So Luxembourg gives this meaning, which aligns perfectly with St Ephrem's interpretation of his own metaphor. Ice fruits, grapes, pass around among them. To see them, you would think they were loose, dispersed pearls. In contrast to Eve's bitter fruit, Paradise offers the fresh fruit of Jesus. Without being aware of this passage of St Ephrem, i.e. in place of that bitter fruit that Eve plucked from the tree, Mary gave mankind sweet fruit. And using purely linguistic means, Luxembourg has suggested a meaning that is very close to that of St Ephrem. You could even argue that he has stumbled across St Ephrem's passage through a long roundabout way, just using linguistic methods. So it's very interesting indeed. So here's that scene, the famous scene of Adam and Eve, and we can see that the devil is holding a grape, and it looks like a red version of the Eucharist, and God comes to Adam and Eve later to offer them clothing. Okay. But you may ask, wasn't the tree in the Garden of Eve an apple tree? In the West, Christians took the tree to be an apple tree due to a pun in Latin. That's because the Latin word for apple is malum, while the Latin word for evil is malum, and so therefore it was a good pun to use, and the Passion plays from medieval times popularized that view. Some of the church fathers considered it maybe that the tree was a fig tree, and there's some supporting biblical text for that. For example, Adam and Eve were wearing fig leaves to cover themselves, and that would fit in with that. Based on the idea that the tree of knowledge is a way of partaking of God, some church fathers, including St Ephrem the Syrian, put forth the suggestion that the tree was a grapevine, for it was wine, the fruit of the grapevine, that Christ turned into his most pure blood during the Last Supper. The Lord said, "I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman." So I think that makes perfect sense, and I think St Ephrem has got a very rich ground on which to develop various metaphors from that. Now, as we saw before, and just a reminder, the Peshitta uses Yalda to mean fruit, child, in terms of the fruit of the vine passage. For St Ephrem, sometimes the tree is God, at other times it is Mary, with Jesus as the fruit of the tree. And a perfect example of that would be in Luke 1:42, when Elizabeth says, "Blessed is the fruit of your womb." Now, the nice thing about Aramaic is that she could have said, "Blessed is the child of your womb," but it also means fruit of your womb. So that's, very kind of picturesque. And what's interesting, that even when the gospel was written in Greek, they tried to retain that double meaning there. Now, in terms of the Hurin, Luxembourg renders the Hurin as white, crystal clear grapes. Okay, not wide-eyed virgins. Griffiths says Luxembourg neglects finding instances of the actual currency in Syriac literature of phrases like his postulated white crystal grapes, construed on the basis of grammatical and lexical possibilities alone. So this is the failing of Luxembourg. He hasn't actually gone and found these passages. So I think what's really good today is we can actually refer to numerous instances where St Ephrem is using these types of images and ideas and words. Okay. So, white crystal clear grape, where does that show up? However, the Qur'an's reconstructed phrase, white crystal clear grapes, as Luxembourg sees it, is remarkably consistent with St Ephrem's extended metaphors of Christ as pearls and grapes. If we look at Midrasha on Faith, hymn 1, which we looked at the beginning, he's entirely light, so that's crystal clear. In its clarity, that's again means the same as crystal clear. I saw the clear one, again that's crystal clear. Who is not clouded, again that means crystal clear. In its purity, arguably same meaning. A great mystery, the body of our Lord, which is unsullied or pure, which you could argue is another synonym for crystal clear. So I think just here we have the evidence that Griffiths said that Luxembourg lacked. And in terms of white grape, or at least grape, we have it here. St Ephrem, the quote that we mentioned earlier on, the virginal vine has borne a grape, whose sweet wine has given comfort to those who mourn. So it's clearly referring to Jesus there. So I think we tie those two together, we have the white crystal clear grape. So when we return then to Surah 37, 48 to 49, and if we remember, this is what Bell had rendered it: with them are damsels restrained in glance wide-eyed, as they were eggs or pearls well guarded. Luxembourg gives a far better and more sensible translation. They will have at their disposal hanging fruits for the picking, jewels like as were they pearls yet enclosed in the shell. So what we have here in this verse in Surah 37 is not just one, but two very common symbols for Christ that St Ephrem frequently uses. The grapes, which is the first part, and pearls in the second part. I think this is the solution for this strange text in the Quran. It's just simply been misconstrued later. So again, just to reiterate, we see the hanging fruits and the pearls in that ayah, and note that these are two common symbols for Christ used by St Ephrem, grapes and pearls used in the same Quranic verse. Okay, so let's have a look at Surah 76. And what we're going to be quite amazed at is the abundance of typical St Ephrem imagery in Surah 76. So let's have a look at that. Okay, so this could easily be considered a Christian text. If we look at the top part, we guided him to the way. The way is the ancient word for Christianity. From the 1st and 2nd century onwards, they were referring to the movement as the way. And so therefore, this could be taken in that sense. St Ephrem was living in the 4th century, so you'd expect him to use that language. Again, I just remind you, this is a surah in the Quran. This is not St Ephrem, but it reads very like St Ephrem. We have prepared for the faithless chains and yokes and a searing fire. There are instances of that in St Ephrem's hymns, warning about the dangers of hell, so that wouldn't be out of place. Number 5 there, but the righteous will drink from a cup whose mixture is aroma. Drink from a cup, of this meaning there would be the Eucharistic cup. 6, a spring from which the servants of Allah will drink, making it gush abundantly. Well, if you look to John 4:13, Jesus answered, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. So that's pretty much the same. It's just a paraphrase really of John 4:13. If we look to 8, they feed for the love of him, the poor, the orphan and the captive. If we look at Matthew 25:35, we have the parable of the goats and sheep, and basically in that Jesus is telling people that those who go to heaven will have fed the hungry, give water to the thirsty, clothed the naked, visited those in prison, and so forth. So this is very much in line with that. And then finally, if we go down to here, we see that they will reward them for their patience with a garden and silk. So the garden is paradise, and we see that imagery in St Ephrem when he describes paradise. So it's very much straight out of St Ephrem's writings, essentially. So we finished at ayah 12 there, the garden and the silk. Let's continue surah 76. Reclining therein on the thrones, experiencing therein neither sun nor frost. So there's an idea of reclining, very much like the Romans lying out, and eating and munching. Its shade hovering over them, and its fruit brought low within reach. So the shade of the vines is very much fitting with that. The fruit sort of hanging down. Passing around them are vessels of silver and cups of crystal. So vessels of silver, cups of crystal, could be, glasses of wine. Crystal of silver, they measure them exactly. They will be served therein with a cup whose flavour is zanzabil. A spring therein, salsabil. Passing among them are eternalized youths. Now we already know that this is referring to grapes. If you see them, you would think them sprinkled pearls. So there's a reference to cups of wine and grapes. And it says at the end, this is a reward for you. Your efforts are well appreciated. So this is an image of paradise exactly as St Ephrem would give it. And if you don't believe me, it's coming up next. We're going to have a look at one example out of many where we could see that. Okay, so we have this madrasha on paradise, which is probably what the Quran used for Surah 76 and paraphrased it. We can see that Luxembourg's rendering fits with Ephrem's hymn perfectly. Surah 37, 48, 49 appears to borrow from it as well. Okay, so just have a look at the imagery. Should you wish to climb up a tree with its lower branches, it will provide steps before your feet, eager to make you recline. Do you remember that reclining bit? In its bosom above, on the couch of its upper branches. So ranges the surface of these branches, bent low and cupped, while yet dense with flowers, that they serve as a protective womb for whoever rests there. Who has ever beheld such a banquet in the very bosom of a tree, with fruit of every savour, ranged for the hand to pluck? Each type of fruit in due sequence approaches, each awaiting its turn, fruit to eat and fruit to quench the thirst. To rinse the hands there is due, and leaves to dry them with, after a treasure store which lacks nothing, whose Lord is rich in all things. So it's very much, and this is just one passage from St Ephrem, we could look at many more, which fills out the picture. And so what you have in Surah 76 is really a condensation of all of these different hymns of St Ephrem. So now in the last section of this video, I'm going to look at a summary of the key decodings of St Ephrem. So we have the grapes, or the grape, which is Jesus. He's the fruit of the vine, he is the child of the vine. And then if we look at the pearl, that's again Jesus. Jesus is the pearl of great value. We could look at Matthew 13:45 as evidence. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. The virgins of paradise are actually Jesus and Mary. Jesus is the grape, Mary is the vine, who offers a womb-like welcome to the souls. All of this got muddled, and Muslims were left with a confused idea of the houris, which the houris were actually originally were referring to grapes, but they got confused about them as ever-virgin concubines in paradise. So they got a kind of a confused notion. They're both virgins and they're concubines. It's very, very strange. This was probably shaped by the influence of harems at caliph palaces, which became the model and daydream of high society. Just as Eve offered the fruit in paradise, Mary was the new Eve, offering the sweet fruit, Jesus, in paradise. Somehow, over time, separated from its Christian roots, the idea of Mary in paradise morphed into the Islamic blasphemous idea of houris in paradise, in complete contradiction of the Bible. As Jesus said, at the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. And what about the 72 virgins? Nowhere in the Quran does it refer to 72 virgins. This appears to come from Al-Tirmidhi. The number 72 is interesting, as 72 hours is 3 days, the length of time Jesus was buried in the tomb. Again, it comes back to Jesus. As to whether he meant it that way, that's open to speculation, but there's certainly no Quranic basis for his idea of 72 virgins. So that's it for today. The Quran clearly has confused the Christian idea of Jesus being a grape and turned it into the houris. Thank you for watching.